May 4th, 1945. Germany was collapsing. Smoke curled from the chimneys of dying cities, and every office with a swastika above its door was burning its own evidence. The war was ending, and with it, the paper trail of annihilation. In a small town near Theresienstadt, the Gestapo's local headquarters stood like a dying beast, its windows glowing with firelight. Inside, clerks fed documents into the furnace by the armful. Deportation lists, prisoner ledgers, census files, the meticulous records of human disappearance. Outside, two men in British uniforms watched the smoke rise. Their jeep was caked with mud, the white star on its hood barely visible. They looked like exhausted officers on patrol. They weren't. They were Jewish agents from Palestine, embedded within the British Army's intelligence corps. Volunteers of the Jewish Brigade, trained to gather evidence of Nazi crimes and track missing refugees. But tonight was different. They weren't after people. They were after proof. The taller one, Captain Chaim Shamir, checked his watch. "Less than an hour," he muttered. "Once they finish, it's gone. All of it." Beside him, Ruth Kagan adjusted her cap, her British insignia crooked. She spoke softly, her Czech accent still visible beneath the English disguise. "Then we go in before the flames do." The street was empty but for the sound of boots and the constant whisper of burning paper. The German garrison had already fled west, trying to surrender to the Americans before the Soviets arrived. Only a handful of clerks remained, loyal to the bureaucracy even as the Reich itself died. For days, Allied intelligence had intercepted fragments of radio chatter. German officers in Prague and Theresienstadt under orders to destroy all refugee and deportation records before surrender. If they succeeded, tens of thousands of names would vanish forever, the names of those who had once lived, worked, and disappeared into the smoke of the camps. Without those names, there would be no claims, no reunions, no history. And so, on this night between surrender and survival, Shamir and Kagan had come to steal memory itself. They slipped from the jeep and moved toward the Gestapo building. The front doors were barred, but the rear gate hung broken, shattered by shell fire. They passed through an alley thick with soot and paper ash. Some of the pages still floated in the air, drifting like gray snow. On one scrap, Kagan saw a line of type before it turned to ash. "Transport 142, Theresienstadt, to Auschwitz." She caught it in her gloved hand, but it disintegrated. The hallway inside was choked with smoke. A portrait of Hitler lay face down on the floor, its glass cracked. Flames licked through the open door of the records room. Two clerks stood there, throwing stacks of ledgers into the fire, their faces ghostly orange. "British intelligence," Shamir barked in German, stepping forward with practiced authority. "Step away from the documents. These are now property of the Allied Military Command." The clerks froze. They had heard that voice before, confident, perfect German, tinged with the rhythm of command. They obeyed. One stepped back, trembling, muttering about orders from Berlin. Kagan moved quickly. She opened a crate beside the wall. Dozens of bound registers, stamped Reich Main Security Office, names, dates, cities, deportation manifests. She began loading them into a burlap sack, her hands shaking. The furnace roared, the heat pressed against their backs. Smoke blurred the air. Every second was a heartbeat lost. "Enough," Shamir said. "We have to go." But Kagan hesitated. On the table was another stack, smaller, marked Kinderlisten, children's lists. She reached for them, even as the flames climbed higher. A beam cracked above them. Fire rained from the ceiling. Shamir grabbed her arm and pulled her out through the back corridor. The sack was heavy, almost tearing. Behind them, the roof gave way, a thunderclap of collapsing timber. The Gestapo records office fell into itself, the night swallowing its last secrets in sparks and smoke. Outside, they threw the sack into the jeep and drove. The town blurred behind them, half in flame, half in silence. Ahead, the road wound through darkness toward the west, toward Allied lines, toward safety, if safety still existed. Shamir's hands were black with soot. He looked at the bag between them. Paper, ink, names. "Not gold," he said, voice breaking, "but worth more." Ruth Kagan turned to look back one last time. The fire behind them was a dying sun. "Let it burn," she said softly. "We already took its light." The war in Europe was ending not with victory parades, but with collapse, a vast, slow implosion of an empire built on cruelty. In the spring of 1945, Germany was a graveyard of flags. Rail lines lay twisted, cities were heaps of brick and dust, and millions wandered the roads without homes, orders, or names. For the Jewish survivors scattered among them, liberation did not mean safety. It meant confusion, freedom without identity. Camps opened, but the records that could prove who anyone was had been burned or stolen. Mothers searched for children, husbands hunted for wives. Lists of the living and the dead were being erased faster than they could be written. To the victors, the war was ending. To the Jews, it was beginning again, this time as a struggle for recognition. In the offices of the Jewish Agency for Palestine, the urgency of the moment was unmistakable. Couriers from Europe arrived daily with fragments of lists, scribbled names from liberated camps, partial transport manifests, letters found in abandoned train stations. But most of the official Nazi documents, the ledgers that tracked deportations, confiscations, and resettlement orders, were vanishing in the last days of the Reich. Without those records, no one could trace who had been taken, who had survived, or where the missing might still be. Without them, thousands would remain ghosts in official silence. From Tel Aviv to London, Jewish agency operatives pleaded with Allied authorities to secure the archives before they were destroyed. But the Allies were overwhelmed. Germany was disintegrating faster than it could be occupied. The priority was ending the fighting, not saving paperwork. And so the task fell to the few who understood that paper was proof, and proof was survival. These were not soldiers or diplomats. They were linguists, smugglers, couriers, Jews who had escaped Europe only to return under false British uniforms. They worked within the Jewish Brigade, a military unit of the British Army composed of volunteers from the Yishuv. Officially, they guarded prisoners and escorted refugees. Unofficially, they gathered intelligence, hunted war criminals, and searched for evidence before it disappeared. Among them were the operatives who would later form the backbone of Israel's future intelligence services. Men and women who understood that in the age of bureaucracy, truth existed only on paper. By late April 1945, Allied signals intelligence had intercepted messages from Nazi administrative centers across Czechoslovakia and Austria. Whole archives were being burned. The Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration, responsible for cataloging deportations, had begun destroying its ledgers in Prague. The Gestapo's Section 4B4, once directed by Adolf Eichmann, was erasing the last traces of its crimes. If those lists were lost, the record of Europe's Jewish population and the possibility of tracing survivors would vanish with them. In a small office in Cairo, Captain Chaim Shamir received the order that would define his life: intercept the files before they burn. His British superiors called it Operation Salvage. His fellow operatives called it Shirat HaNeshama, the Song of the Soul. He was joined by Ruth Kagan, a Czech-born translator who had fled Prague in 1939 and joined the British as an interpreter. She spoke 6 languages, including the clipped bureaucratic German used in Nazi correspondence. She knew what the documents would look like, how they were stamped, even how they smelled. Their mission was simple in wording, impossible in execution: reach the Nazi archives in northern Czechoslovakia before they were destroyed, retrieve any records connected to Jewish deportations, deliver them to Allied custody intact. The war's last weeks were chaos. Towns changed hands overnight. Roads were clogged with refugees, deserters, and liberated prisoners. The German military still fought where pride demanded it. Soviet artillery thundered from the east. Amid that collapse, Shamir and Kagan crossed into the ruins of Europe disguised as British intelligence officers. Their uniforms were borrowed, their paperwork forged. They carried no radios, no backup, and no orders beyond a single line scrawled in pencil on a slip of paper. What you save now, the world will remember later. Europe was burning its memories. They were there to steal them back. The message came through a scrambled radio transmission late one night, faint, coded, and nearly lost in static. It originated from Prague, a city half in ruins and half in denial. The German garrison there still clung to the illusion of order, while the Red Army advanced from the east. The words were clipped, hurried, spoken in the flat tone of bureaucrats who had run out of time. All lists to be destroyed immediately. Archives of Jewish emigration to be burned, no trace to remain. For the Allied command, it was one more piece of collapsing intelligence. For Captain Chaim Shamir, it was the sound of erasure. Somewhere inside that message was the signal he'd been waiting for, confirmation that the Nazis were carrying out a final administrative execution, the obliteration of proof. Within hours, Shamir and Ruth Kagan were ordered north from Allied headquarters in Vienna. Their cover identities, Major Henry Talbot and Lieutenant Ann Ryder, were carefully constructed, complete with counterfeit orders stamped by the British War Office. They were to join an existing British intelligence patrol investigating war crimes in Czechoslovakia. But their real mission remained known only to 3 people. The stakes were brutal in their simplicity. The Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration had spent years documenting every deportation, every confiscation of property, every transport to the east. The lists were handwritten, carbon-copied, and filed with obsessive precision. Thousands of ledgers, millions of names, and now the same men who had built those archives were racing to destroy them. If those documents vanished, the survivors of Europe would lose their past, and the dead would lose even the dignity of record. The Jewish agency in London had sent a desperate cable. Retrieve whatever you can. Names are life. For Shamir and Kagan, the mission was personal. Shamir's own relatives had vanished somewhere between Krakow and Sobibor. He had spent 2 years in the British Army searching for their names in captured documents. He never found them. Ruth had fled Prague 6 years earlier, leaving her younger brother behind. The refugee lists were the only place he might still exist, even as ink. They drove north in a jeep painted with a fading Allied star, passing through a continent that no longer had borders. The war was ending everywhere and nowhere at once. Villages burned without enemies. Columns of civilians trudged through the fields. Germans fleeing the Soviets. Survivors fleeing memory. In the glove compartment, Kagan kept the coded note from the Prague transmission, folded and refolded until the edges were soft. If they've begun burning, she said, we're already too late. Shamir kept his eyes on the road. Then we steal what's left of the smoke. They crossed into Bohemia under the cover of a British intelligence convoy. Their uniforms passed every checkpoint. The roads were littered with signs of retreat, abandoned tanks, white flags painted on farmhouses, German officers driving west with families in tow. The Reich was bleeding in every direction. At Česká Lípa, they stopped at a requisition school now serving as a Red Cross shelter. The building still smelled of chalk and fear. In a side room, a Czech nurse showed them a stack of papers she had hidden under a floorboard. Transport lists stamped with Nazi seals taken from the local Gestapo office before it fled. Each page was a small miracle. Hundreds of names typed in perfect German order, beside each a date, a destination. Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, Mauthausen. Shamir took the lists gently, his gloves black with dust. These were supposed to burn, he whispered. The nurse nodded. They are burning everything. Police, records, even birth certificates. They want to vanish cleanly. That night they slept in the jeep on the edge of the town. The sound of distant artillery rolled like thunder across the horizon. Shamir wrote a single entry in his notebook. Prague holds the last names. We move at dawn. When they reached the outskirts of Prague 2 days later, the city was already a paradox. Part liberation, part funeral. German offices were burning. Soviet shells lit the sky red. Streams of refugees crossed the Vltava bridges. Somewhere within that chaos stood a 4-story building that had once been the nerve center of Nazi deportation policy in Central Europe. Behind its stone facade, clerks were still working, not typing, not filing, but feeding the past into flames. They arrived on the outskirts of Prague at dawn, their jeep rattling over streets scarred by weeks of shelling. Smoke hung low across the city like a second sky. Columns of German soldiers were retreating west, throwing down their weapons before they even reached the checkpoints. The Reich was dissolving in real time. But its offices still worked with grim discipline. In a small room of a requisitioned villa outside the city, Captain Chaim Shamir unfolded the map across a table littered with empty ammunition boxes. The Gestapo headquarters for Jewish affairs was marked in red, a stone administrative block on Bartholomew Street, once a courthouse, now an archive of extermination. That was their destination. Across from him, Ruth Kagan sorted forged papers with surgical precision. Each was printed on real German stationery, taken from an abandoned SS motor pool. The passes bore the insignia of the Allied Military Intelligence Corps, a fiction created 2 nights earlier by a sympathetic clerk in Vienna who owed Shamir a favor. Their mission had no code name, no record. Officially, they were attached observers. In truth, they were thieves, stealing ghosts from the fire. Kagan looked up from the papers. If the Russians reach the city first, it's over. They won't, Shamir replied. Not before we do. They studied the target. The building was surrounded by rubble, guarded by what little authority remained. A few uniformed officers, mostly clerks who hadn't yet realized the war was finished. Its basement was rumored to hold the remaining archives of the Reich Central Office for Jewish Emigration, files that traced every deportation from Prague, Brno, and Vienna since 1939. The ledgers contained more than names. They held birthplaces, family links, property confiscations, proof of genocide, catalogued in ink. The plan was brutally simple. Enter the building posing as British intelligence officers sent to secure Nazi records for Allied custody. Confiscate what they could. Evacuate before the Soviets or local partisans reached the district. But execution was another matter. The city was in chaos. No command, no clarity. Every uniform was suspect. Every salute might lead to a bullet. To strengthen the illusion, Shamir secured 2 local volunteers, Josef Horak, a Czech resistance courier fluent in German, and Leah Stein, a Jewish refugee from Bratislava whose husband had perished in Auschwitz. They would drive a captured German staff car bearing British markings, its license plates repainted with trembling hands. Horak asked, "What do we call this operation?" Shamir hesitated, then said quietly, "We don't. If it fails, it never happened." That night they moved through Prague under blackout. The sound of artillery to the east grew louder. The Soviets were hours away. Street by street, the city was a shifting battlefield of ideology and exhaustion. Civilians huddled in basements. Partisans executed SS men in alleys. Every window was a question. In a makeshift safe house, Ruth rehearsed the part she would play. Her accent was Czech German, her demeanor official. Her forged credentials listed her as Lieutenant Ann Ryder. Intelligence Branch, Allied Command Vienna. Shamir would be Major Henry Talbot, the commanding officer. Their orders: to secure, classify, and transfer German civil documentation relevant to the Jewish Emigration Office. It was the perfect lie, because it was almost true. Before leaving, Kagan tucked a photograph of her brother into her breast pocket. She hadn't seen him since 1939. She had no idea if he lived, but somewhere in those ledgers might be a line, a transport number, a date that told her how he died. At 05 o'clock, they set off toward the city center. Dawn light glimmered over the Vltava River, turning its surface to glass. Smoke rose from government buildings like slow-moving storm clouds. When they reached Bartholomew Street, the Gestapo headquarters still stood. Its windows were open, papers fluttering like birds. A German officer stood at the gate, exhausted, his uniform filthy, his pistol hanging from his belt. Shamir stepped from the car and saluted. "Major Henry Talbot, Allied Intelligence. We're here to take control of your archives." The officer blinked, too tired to protest. "You're early," he muttered. "We were told the Americans would come." "They sent us instead," Shamir said, handing him forged authorization papers. "We'll need access to the records, Mayor, immediately." The guard nodded slowly and motioned them inside. As they crossed the threshold, Ruth glanced up. The Reich's emblem above the door was cracked, half broken by shell fire. The swastika still clung to its ring of stone, stubborn even in ruin. Inside, the corridors smelled of smoke and damp ink. Typists worked feverishly under portraits of men who no longer ruled anything. Every desk was stacked with documents waiting for the fire. Shamir whispered, "We're in. Now find the names." And somewhere in the maze of files and ashes, history waited, not to be written, but to be rescued. The building was collapsing from the inside, not in structure, but in spirit. The marble corridors of the Gestapo headquarters echoed with the hollow rhythm of endings. Typewriters clattered without purpose. Files were moved from one office to another only to be burned by men who no longer believed in the empire that had commanded them. Captain Chaim Shamir and Ruth Kagan, in their British uniforms, stepped through the front hall as if they belonged there. No one questioned them. The swiftness of defeat had dulled suspicion. Even authority obeyed the illusion of authority. A young German clerk, sweat-streaked and frightened, saluted Shamir. "Herr Major, orders from Berlin. Destroy all refugee records by noon." Shamir nodded gravely. "That's precisely why we're here. The files are no longer your responsibility. They are property of the Allied War Crimes Division." His tone was sharp, his accent flawless, the kind of voice born of certainty, not truth. The clerk obeyed instantly, grateful to surrender command. Inside the main archive room, smoke drifted in lazy spirals from a burning waste bin. Half the ledgers were stacked in neat piles, the other half had already turned to ash. The air was thick with the scent of ink, leather, and scorched paper. Ruth stepped to a nearby cabinet. It was labeled Abteilung 4B4, Jüdische Angelegenheiten. She opened it slowly. Inside were dozens of binders, each stamped with a black eagle seal and marked by year. 1939, 1940, 1941, 1942. She pulled one out, brushing away a layer of soot. The title read, "Deportations from Prague, Brno, and Olomouc." Her hands trembled. The ledger's pages were filled with names in perfect columns, the handwriting mechanical, each line a life reduced to a destination. Katz, Jakob, Transport 241, Theresienstadt, Kagan, Aaron, Transport 259, Auschwitz. She stopped. Her brother's name. For a long moment, she couldn't move. The letters blurred, her breath caught in the back of her throat. Shamir placed a hand on her shoulder but said nothing. There was no language for what they were rescuing. Down the hall, the sounds of chaos grew louder. Orders shouted, boots running, furniture overturned. Someone screamed that Soviet troops were at the river. The last command from Berlin had just reached the building. "Burn everything." The Gestapo officer in charge, an aging man with a limp and eyes like ash, stormed into the archive. "Who are you?" he demanded, seeing Shamir and Ruth among the files. "British military intelligence," Shamir replied evenly, showing forged credentials. "I have direct orders from Field Marshal Montgomery. These documents are evidence for the Allied tribunals. You will stop the destruction immediately." The German hesitated. He was armed, but weary. Behind him, the distant rumble of artillery was unmistakable. The Soviets were hours away. His loyalty was to survival now. "Fine," he muttered, lowering his weapon. "Take them. It no longer matters." Ruth exhaled slowly, her pulse hammering in her ears. She and Shamir moved fast, collecting ledgers, stacking them in crates, sealing them with rope and wax. Each volume was heavier than its size suggested, as though the pages carried the weight of every name written inside. Outside, the streets were filling with refugees, soldiers, and fire. The sound of glass breaking echoed through the corridors as mobs tore down portraits of Nazi officials. The air was electric with vengeance and confusion. At 11:20, a junior officer burst into the archive, shouting, "The Russians are crossing the bridge! We're evacuating!" Shamir met Ruth's eyes. "Time's up." They grabbed what they could. 6 crates, maybe a tenth of the total collection. The rest would burn before nightfall. Together with Horak and Leah Stein, they hauled the boxes down the marble steps, past a bronze eagle torn from its pedestal. Outside, black smoke rose from nearby buildings. A truck burned at the corner. The sound of distant gunfire rolled through the streets like a heartbeat. They loaded the crates into their car. As the engine coughed to life, Ruth looked back once more at the building. Flames licked from the upper windows. Pages drifted into the air like snow. She whispered, "It's burning again. Only this time, we're the thieves." Shamir pressed the accelerator. The car surged forward through the crowd, dodging debris and fleeing soldiers. Behind them, the archive that had enslaved a people vanished into fire. But its memory, at least in part, was saved. They turned west, toward the collapsing front lines, 6 boxes of fragile evidence clattering in the back seat. 6 boxes heavier than all of Germany's lies. And in that moment, as Prague burned and empires died, 2 unknown agents carried the only thing more powerful than victory itself, the proof of what had been done. The road out of Prague was a corridor of ghosts. Trucks burned on the shoulders, their cargo scattered. Uniforms, boots, paper. The air tasted of ash and oil. Every bridge had been half destroyed, every checkpoint abandoned or manned by deserters who no longer cared which flag they saluted. The sun sank behind the hills as Captain Chaim Shamir and Ruth Kagan drove west toward Allied lines, the 6 crates of ledgers swaying in the back of the car like fragile coffins. In the distance, artillery thundered, Soviet shells lighting the horizon red. The war was ending, but death had not yet received the message. They stopped that night in a deserted village outside Plzeň. The houses were hollow shells, the streets littered with propaganda posters flapping weakly in the wind. Inside a ruined tavern, they set up a lantern, its glow barely enough to cut through the dark. Ruth sat beside the crates, wiping soot from their lids. Each was stamped with the Reich seal, the black eagle now cracked by bullet holes. Inside lay the refugee and deportation lists, columns of names, each a thread in a web of loss, stretching across Europe. The handwriting was precise, the ink still sharp, as if the clerks who'd written them had believed their work would last forever. Shamir crouched beside her, checking the bindings. "If we lose even one, it will be like losing them twice." Ruth nodded. Her face was gray with exhaustion. "We already lost most of them once." Outside, the rumble of engines echoed faintly. They doused the light. Through a broken window, Shamir saw the silhouettes of soldiers, German stragglers retreating west. He gripped his pistol and waited. The convoy passed without stopping, their headlights sweeping briefly across the tavern before disappearing into the dark. When the silence returned, he turned back to the ledgers. They opened one crate together, and for the first time since entering the archives, they looked closely. Page after page, name after name. Birth dates, addresses, destinations. Columns labeled Judenvermögen beschlagnahmt, Jewish property confiscated. Notes in the margins marked Transport abgeschlossen. transport completed. Ruth's hand trembled as she traced one entry. Kagan, Aaron, age 12, transport 259, Auschwitz, 2 October 1943. Her brother. She closed the book and whispered, "Now I know." There was no comfort in discovery, only confirmation. But even grief was better than uncertainty. Shamir sat beside her in silence. Outside, the wind rose again, blowing stray pages across the floor. Some were blank, others carried fragments of lives, receipts, letters, family inventories, history scattered like confetti in the ruins of empire. Near midnight, headlights appeared at the end of the street. A Soviet reconnaissance truck, its red star faint under mud. Shamir went to the window, watching carefully. 2 soldiers climbed out, rifles slung low. They were young, laughing, drunk on victory. He waited until they moved on. Ruth whispered, "We'll never make it if we stay on the roads. The Soviets will seize everything." He nodded. "Then we go south, through the fields, find the Americans." Before dawn, they buried one of the crates beneath the tavern's cellar floorboards. Insurance in case they were captured. The rest they loaded back into the car. The engine sputtered but caught, a mechanical prayer answered by chance. As they drove, the eastern sky began to pale. The fields around them were littered with abandoned weapons, and once they passed a convoy of German POWs marching under Czech guards, their eyes hollow, their boots leaving shallow tracks in the mud. By noon, smoke from another town rose ahead, not battle smoke, but the smell of burning paper. Another office purging its files. Ruth clenched the wheel tighter. "It's happening everywhere," she said. "Yes," Shamir replied quietly. "They're trying to erase us faster than we can prove we existed." That evening, they reached a checkpoint manned by American soldiers. A weathered corporal stopped them, his rifle low. "British intelligence, huh?" he said, glancing at their uniforms. "You're a long way from London." Shamir smiled faintly. "War's a big place, Corporal. We just cleaned up a mess in Prague." The corporal waved them through without inspecting the cargo. The crates rattled as they passed the checkpoint. 6 boxes of fragile proof crossing a line between oblivion and memory. When night fell again, they camped in a farmhouse courtyard. The moon rose over the fields, silver and indifferent. Ruth leaned against the crates, too tired to sleep. Shamir watched the horizon, listening to the echo of distant guns. In the glow of their small fire, he opened one of the ledgers again and whispered, "They thought this paper was their victory. But now, it's ours." Ruth didn't answer. She was staring at the crates, her eyes reflecting firelight. The night around them was quiet, the kind of quiet that only follows the end of worlds. And in that stillness, the ink of the names seemed almost to breathe. By the time they reached the Bavarian border, exhaustion had become its own language. They spoke little, conserving breath and faith alike. The car rattled over broken roads, its suspension groaning under the weight of 6 wooden crates that carried more than they could ever explain. The countryside was a museum of defeat. Farmhouses gutted, rail lines splintered, churches turned into field hospitals. Every mile west felt both closer to safety and further from reason. The war was ending everywhere, but its ghosts refused to die. They stopped outside a small village near Regensburg. A bridge ahead had been blown apart by retreating Germans, and the detour would add hours they didn't have. The air smelled of rain and rust. "Rest," Shamir said softly. "We can't run on nothing." Ruth didn't answer. She was staring at the crates in the back seat, her face pale and distant. "How many do you think we saved?" she asked. "Enough," he said. "How many burned?" Shamir hesitated. "More," she nodded slowly. "It's always more." They moved into the barn of an abandoned farmhouse. It was quiet except for the rain tapping on the roof. Shamir unlatched one crate and began inspecting the ledgers. making sure the damp hadn't seeped in. The pages were intact, though the ink had begun to blur around the edges. Each volume carried a distinct smell: soot, smoke, the faint sweetness of aged glue. History, preserved by accident. Ruth picked one up and turned its pages slowly. Deportationen Wien Theresienstadt, 1943. She stopped at a line where a clerk's pen had run dry halfway through a name. The mark looked like a wound. "These aren't just names," she murmured. "They're proof that someone cared enough to write them, even if it was for the wrong reason." She closed the ledger, her fingers trembling. "I keep thinking about the others still burning. Whole lives turning to smoke while we're out here with scraps." Shamir sat beside her, his voice low. Scraps are what history is built from. He didn't tell her the truth, that he'd seen the Gestapo officer throw half the archives into the furnace before they arrived, that he'd watched pages curl, blacken, and turn to ash while soldiers laughed and sang in the courtyard. He didn't tell her that her brother's name had been one of the last he'd seen before the flames reached the shelf. They slept little that night. Rain drummed the roof until dawn. When they woke, the road ahead was a river of mud. Shamir climbed onto the Jeep's bumper to check the crates. One was missing. Tracks in the mud led to the tree line. He followed them until he saw a shape lying face down in the ditch. Joseph Horak, their Czech driver. Shot once in the back. The crate beside him had been pried open. Pages were scattered in the mud, soaked and unreadable. Bandits or deserters. It didn't matter. Shamir knelt beside the body, closing the man's eyes. He saved more than he knew. They gathered what papers they could, dripping, half-torn, and placed them back in the crate. Ruth didn't speak as they worked. She simply lifted the damaged ledger and pressed it against her chest, as if holding it close could keep it from dissolving. By midday, they were back on the road, their speed reduced by the slick mud and their silence. That evening, they saw the smoke. Ahead, a convoy of trucks burned by the roadside, Allied insignia barely visible through the flames. Shamir pulled over, heart sinking. Inside one of the wrecked vehicles lay a familiar face. Leah Stein, their courier. She had been carrying the sealed envelope of identification papers and route codes. He crouched beside her body. There was no time for burial, no time for words. He took the envelope, already half-scorched, and turned back toward the car. Ruth stood by the road, her expression hollow. "We're the only ones left," Shamir nodded. "Then we finish it." By nightfall, they reached an Allied outpost near Nuremberg. The sentry at the gate was an American lieutenant, barely 20, cigarette hanging from his lip. "British intelligence?" he asked, eyeing their uniforms. Shamir handed him the forged papers. "We've got war crimes evidence from Prague. Needs immediate transfer." The lieutenant shrugged, waved them through. "Whatever's left of the war, you can have it." Inside the compound, they parked beneath a rusted water tower. The rain had stopped. The crates sat in the back, glistening faintly under the floodlight. Ruth brushed her fingers over one lid, leaving streaks in the dust. "3 of us gone," she whispered. "But we made it." Shamir nodded. His voice was almost gone. "At least the names did." She turned to him. "Do you think anyone will care?" He looked toward the horizon, black, endless, indifferent. "Someday." That night, he sat alone beside the crates, the sound of thunder fading into silence. Each box felt impossibly heavy. Not from weight, but from meaning. They had saved thousands of names, but lost almost everyone who'd carried them. The war had ended, but the cost of memory was still being paid, one life for every page. The morning after the storm, the sky hung low and gray, the color of paper left too long in smoke. The war, they were told, was officially over, but no one believed it. The roads were still crowded with the living and the lost. Soldiers without nations, civilians without homes, survivors without names. Captain Chaim Shamir and Ruth Kagan stood beside their battered jeep in the mud of an Allied checkpoint outside Nuremberg. The crates of rescued ledgers stacked neatly behind them. The air smelled of diesel and wet earth. A young British officer flipped through their forged documents, his brow furrowed. "These are Gestapo files," he asked. "Refugee records," Shamir replied. "Evidence for the tribunals." The officer shrugged, waved them on. "Take them to Munich. The Americans are sorting that mess now." They drove south along cracked roads lined with refugees. The car moved slowly, weighted down by its cargo. Ruth stared through the windshield, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Every mile felt heavier, not from distance, but from history pressing in around them. Villages smoldered in silence. Churches stood roofless, bells melted into twisted iron. On the outskirts of one town, they passed a train yard filled with freight cars, their doors open, their interiors still lined with the marks of fingernails. Neither of them spoke. By dusk, they reached a burned-out farmhouse and stopped for rest. The jeep's engine hissed softly, cooling in the evening air. Ruth climbed out, stretching her sore limbs, then walked to the back of the vehicle. She lifted one crate lid and stared down at the ledgers inside, rows upon rows of names, still legible, still waiting. Shamir joined her. "We'll deliver them tomorrow," he said. Ruth nodded absently. "And then what?" "Then we start again." "How many times can people start again?" she asked, her voice thin. "As many as it takes," he said. They ate cold rations beside a small fire. Around them the night was vast and patient. For the first time in months, no gunfire echoed. Only the wind moved, carrying the faint smell of smoke from somewhere far away. The scent of endings that refused to end. Ruth reached into her coat and pulled out a single sheet of paper, half burned. It was one of the damaged pages they had recovered from Horak's crate. The ink smeared, but a few names still visible. She read them aloud quietly, one by one, until the list ended. Then she folded it carefully and slipped it into her pocket. "I'll keep this one," she said, "for the ones we couldn't save." The next morning they continued south. The closer they came to Munich, the denser the traffic became. Columns of Allied vehicles, Red Cross trucks, prisoners and freed refugees. Signs pointed to displaced persons camps hastily erected in schools and warehouses. At one camp, they stopped to refuel. The refugees there were mostly children, thin, blank-eyed, wrapped in coats too large for them. Ruth spoke to a British nurse explaining their cargo. The nurse hesitated, then pointed to a small building near the edge of the camp. "You should see them," she said. "Maybe you'll understand what you've brought." Inside, rows of desks filled a dimly lit room. Volunteers, some Jewish, some not, were sorting lists. Not food supplies, not medical inventories, but names. Piles of them. Names sent by telegram from Poland, Hungary, Austria. Survivors looking for relatives, children searching for parents. Ruth stood frozen in the doorway. The sound of typewriters filled the air, mechanical and relentless, but not cruel. It was the sound of the world trying to rebuild itself through identification. "These are what we saved," Shamir whispered. "Not paper. Connection." When they left the camp, Ruth wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "If even one name from our lists finds one of them," Shamir finished her sentence softly, "then it was worth everything." That night they reached Munich. The city was a carcass of empire, half bombed, half silent, caught between guilt and reconstruction. They drove to the Allied command post, a commandeered university building surrounded by barbed wire. Guards stopped them at the gate, then waved them inside when they saw the British insignia. They parked in the courtyard. For a long moment, neither moved. The crates sat in the back of the jeep like 6 small monuments. Finally, Ruth reached over, opened one of them, and ran her hand along the edges of the ledgers. The paper felt warm from the sun. She closed her eyes. "It's strange," she said. "We didn't save people. We saved proof that they existed." Shamir nodded. "That's all history ever really is." Together they carried the crates up the stairs and into the Allied documentation office. A clerk with tired eyes signed a receipt without looking up. "These'll go to London or Jerusalem," he said. "Wherever the lawyers decide." Ruth stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching as the clerk stacked the crates against a wall. Each bore a small label now. "Recovered Nazi records, Czechoslovakia. No ceremony, no announcement. Just paperwork absorbing paper." Outside, the wind carried the smell of rain again. Shamir lit a cigarette and exhaled slowly. "It's over," he said. Ruth shook her head. "Not for the names." They walked away as the first drops began to fall, the streets shining under the light of a war that refused to fade. Behind them, in that quiet office, the ledgers sat waiting, black covers gleaming in the dim light, each one a map of absence. Through the ashes of a continent, two nameless spies had carried history in their hands. And though no one yet understood, the war's truest rescue had already been made. Months passed. The guns fell silent, the flags changed, and Europe tried to remember itself. But for millions, memory was all that remained. And even that was broken. In London, a grey building on Great Russell Street became the quiet epicenter of a different kind of reconstruction. Inside its narrow halls, clerks of the Jewish Agency's Bureau for Missing Relatives worked by candlelight and exhaustion. Their desks overflowed with letters, telegrams, and half-burned papers carried by couriers from the continent. And among those papers, stacked carefully in wooden crates marked "Recovered Prague, 1945." were the ledgers rescued by Captain Chaim Shamir and Ruth Kagan. The soot still clung to their bindings. The ink still smelled faintly of smoke. The Bureau's task was simple in words, impossible in practice: to trace the missing, to find among millions displaced and dead the living threads that still connected names to faces. The work began in silence. Pages were opened, scanned, transcribed. Columns of deportations cross-checked against fragments from Red Cross lists, Allied interrogation notes, and camp records smuggled out by survivors. Each match, a date, a birthplace, a surname repeated, was a spark in the darkness. For the first time, the chaos of genocide was being reversed line by line. One night, a clerk paused over a page from the Theresienstadt transport register. "Kagan, Aaron." He wrote a note in the margin. "Listed, no return recorded." Then he copied the name onto a separate sheet titled "Children Unaccounted For." When Ruth saw it weeks later in London, she didn't cry. She simply folded the paper once and placed it in her coat pocket, the same way she had folded the burned fragment months before. Proof, not of survival, but of existence. The Bureau's reports began circulating to Jewish communities in Paris, Rome, Athens, and Tel Aviv. For the first time, families who had lost everything began to receive telegrams. Relative located in displaced persons camp. Confirmed on refugee transport to Sweden. No record found. Presumed perished. Each message carried the weight of both revelation and mourning. The living received their own names back through wires and carbon copies. The dead received remembrance. The British military authorities did not publicize the mission. To them, the records were just evidence, supporting material for the coming trials at Nuremberg. But the Jewish Agency understood their deeper purpose. The lists were not just legal proof of murder. They were the foundation of life after it. The ledgers became the basis for the Central Jewish Historical Commission, later absorbed into Yad Vashem. Every file, every line of text from those 6 crates was copied and archived. Decades later, researchers would identify thousands of individuals through them: men, women, children once reduced to numbers, restored to names. But for the people who had risked everything to save them, the recognition never came. No medals, no citations, no mentions in history books. Their mission remained classified, their names absent from the records they had preserved. Ruth Kagan stayed in Europe after the war, helping the Jewish agency coordinate the immigration of displaced survivors to Palestine. She rarely spoke of Prague, except once, when asked by a reporter what it had been like. She said only, "We carried ghosts, but ghosts are heavier than you think." Shamir returned to Tel Aviv in 1946. He joined the Haganah's intelligence unit, using the same forged document techniques he had perfected in wartime. When Israel declared independence 2 years later, he stood on a rooftop in Haifa, listening to the radio broadcast of Ben-Gurion's speech, and thought not of victory but of paper, those pages in London, still whispering their names into history. In time, both would vanish into quiet anonymity. But their work endured. When the Nuremberg trials opened, prosecutors held up captured Nazi documents, proof of deportations, property seizures, execution orders. Many of those files had come from the archives Shamir and Kagan had smuggled out. Their handwriting was still visible on some of the covers, where they had written the word Beweis, evidence. The judges read the names aloud in court, one by one. In that solemn cadence, the dead were finally heard. And across Europe, survivors searching for families saw those names reprinted in bulletins and camp newsletters. Sometimes a single line changed a life, confirmed alive. The ledgers of the living and the dead, once destined for fire, had become the spine of remembrance itself. History did not thank them. It rarely does. But every name that found its way home was a whisper of gratitude, passed through paper, through time, through silence. And somewhere in London, in a storage room that smelled faintly of dust and burned leather, 6 wooden crates sat in stillness, their lids nailed shut, their contents safe. The war was over. But their cargo, memory, would never end. Decades later, long after uniforms had turned to dust and battlefields to farmlands, a quiet researcher in Jerusalem opened one of the same ledgers that Chaim Shamir and Ruth Kagan had carried through the war. The pages were brittle, yellow at the edges, still faintly smelling of smoke. In careful script, the archivist wrote a new heading at the top of the catalog card. Recovered Nazi Deportation Registers. Prague, 1945. Source: unknown operatives. No one knew the story behind those crates anymore, only that they had arrived in London under British seal, then transferred to the Jewish Historical Commission in 1946. Their origins were lost in bureaucracy, their rescuers erased by secrecy. But the names inside endured. Thousands of them, perfectly preserved, were eventually digitized by Yad Vashem and cross-referenced with survivor testimonies. Children once thought lost were rediscovered in distant lands. Entire family lines rebuilt themselves from the ashes of paperwork. Every name had been meant for erasure, every entry an obituary disguised as administration. Yet each word, written by the hand of a clerk in an empire of death, became, through an act of theft and defiance, a tool of resurrection. In a post-war letter discovered years later, a British officer wrote from Munich to his superiors, "The Jewish operatives attached to our intelligence unit seem unusually intent on preserving captured civil documents. They insist these records will matter later. They may be right." He had no idea how right he was. Because when the smoke cleared and the world began to rebuild its conscience, truth was not found in speeches or monuments. It was found in ink. The ledgers became more than history. They became witness. Every page that Shamir and Kagan had carried through rain and gunfire told a story the Nazis had tried to silence. That identity could not be burned, and memory could not be legislated out of existence. For the survivors who found their families through those records, the ledgers were proof that the world had not entirely forgotten them. For the generations born later, they were the inheritance of names, fragile, sacred, weightless only in appearance. In the archives of Jerusalem today, the pages still whisper faintly when turned. Their lines remain sharp, the handwriting precise, even after 80 years, as if the ink refuses to fade out of respect for those it names. On the inside cover of one volume, written in pencil so faint it is almost invisible, are two English words: "We returned." No one knows who wrote them. Perhaps Ruth, perhaps Chaim, perhaps a clerk who understood. What matters is that they survived, both the words and the names. The war that created those lists ended in gunfire, but the battle to preserve their truth was fought in silence. By two strangers driving through the ruins of Europe with a cargo more precious than gold, more fragile than life. Their faces are gone. Their records are sealed. Their story was never told in courtrooms or history books. But their legacy is everywhere, in every database of survivors, every document that connects the living to the dead. In a century defined by loss, they proved that salvation could be measured not in victories, but in names saved from fire. Because in the end, nations rise and fall, monuments crumble, and archives decay. But paper, when guarded by conscience, can outlive empires. They stole the past to give the future a memory, and that memory became a nation. They were spies, they were thieves, but above all, they were witnesses.